Hello and welcome to the Airline Weekly Lounge. I'm your host, Gordon Smith, and this week I'm joined by co-host Jay Shabat to discuss the latest developments at airlines right across Europe. Hi, Jay, how's it going?
It's good to be back in the lounge, Gordon.
Oh, it is. And actually, we start the show in pretty much the same format every time. Let me shake it up. Guten Tag, bonjour, and wait for this last one. Hilva it ita fiver.
Whoa.
Apologies for any listeners I've offended there. Can you guess the languages?
Wow. That I don't think it has anything to do with what we're about to talk about, or am I wrong?
No resemblance, no link whatsoever. Just some random noises from the European continent presented at you. No, of course they do. That was Guten Tag from Germany, Bonjour from France, and let me try this one again. Hilva ita paiva from Finland. Uh, no, no dunce hat as we had in the Victorian times in Britain. It was a sort of conical hat with a D on it. If you were bad in class in the old days, I don't know if you had that in the USJ.
Yeah,
Anyway,
the
we digress.
dunce
No
cap,
dunce.
we called it. Yeah,
Did you have that? The dunce hat?
the dunce cap. Sure, sure. I mean, we
Yeah.
didn't have it. I mean, but it's something that we would talk. Yeah, so it's a common reference, but that we'd use. But
Okay.
no, and no, I personally never had to wear one.
Not
Although
suggesting you.
some of my teachers may have wanted to put one on me at times, but
Not suggesting that you were old enough to be around in the Victorian times, which I think that was pretty much the 1800s. Anyway, yeah, no dunce hat if you didn't get that last one. That was Finnish. And that is a little clue as to the airlines and the regions that we will be discussing on today's podcast, because it's been a busy week with earnings. We are in the thick of earnings season, as regular listeners will know. Part one, we're going to focus on two of the European heavyweights, the Lufthansa Group, and then briefly touch on Air France KLM. Jay, tell our listeners what they need to know about Lufthansa's latest earnings.
sure, and we are talking on Tuesday morning. That's my time here in the Philadelphia suburbs. A couple hours later, over on your side of the pond. Again, Tuesday morning, and Lufthansa and Air France KLM just reported their first quarter results. So it's hot off the presses. I was able to just in the little bit of time before this call, a couple hours before this call, was able to listen to part of about two-thirds of the Lufthansa earnings call, and I have not done the Air France call yet. So just a little bit of context. That's why we'll be focusing a little bit more of this discussion on Lufthansa, and certainly check out the the upcoming issue of Airline Weekly, and we'll have all of these airlines covered in depth. So Lufthansa, I do have the numbers, the sort of the headline margin numbers for both carriers, with a little bit of detail by their various subsidiaries. So let's begin. Lufthansa had a just horrible quarter, negative 11% operating margin, and that might not come as a surprise to most of you if you've been following what's happening with all the labor unrest that occurred over the course of the first quarter. They said the strikes and whatnot, and not even including they were actually affected by strikes at airport at some of the German airports, but just strikes within the company cost them about 380 million US dollars. It's about
Ouch.
350 million euros. Yeah, that's a huge amount of money. Highly disruptive. And just doing simple math there, if you pull that, if you kind of put that money back in, their operating margin would have been -7 rather than -11. Quite a bit better. And keep in mind, this is the first quarter, so it's no big surprise when a European airline loses money in the first quarter. For example, last quarter they had a -4% operating margin, and Lufthansa did. And kind of mostly right down the board, the sort of mainline Lufthansa branded passenger airline, -20% operating margin. So you could really see the pain when you drill it down by some of these airlines. Austrian -30%. Brussels,
Whoa.
yeah, it
What
was
happened there?
well, it's I mean also just the labor unrest, and it's it's not Austrian hasn't been really an easy go for Lufthansa over really ever since it bought it back. I don't know. It's been almost 20 years, and it's they've had moments. I mean, there were moments actually coming out of the pandemic when Austrian was looking pretty good. A lot of their low cost competition had pulled out, and but yeah, it was pretty messy. Brussels, not a whole lot better, -20%. Eurowings, -33%. But you might guess there was one. There's always one star of the show. There's always one pupil that always seems to stand out every time Lufthansa, steps up to the plate, and that was Swiss Airlines. Always seems to make money, and sure enough, despite all the unrest throughout the group, they did positive 2% operating margin, which for again off peak first quarter, generally the slowest time of the year, that is a fantastic result. So uh, kudos to Swiss again. So yeah, there's your numbers. What we can drill a little bit down into those details in a second. I should also add, because it's extremely important to Lufthansa, they have a giant maintenance group, as I always remind people. It's actually, in revenue terms, actually larger than the entire Swiss airline. So huge MRO there, maintenance repair organization, and that thing made money 7%. So if you're wondering why, Swiss -20, or sorry, Lufthansa mainline -20 and Austrian -30, etc. Why did the group only have -11? That was because they were helped a lot by profits at the maintenance unit. Cargo lost money too, by the way, but just -3%. That's a pretty big operation too. Cargo is quite a bit bigger, for example, than Austrian. So let's move on to Air France KLM. A little bit of a shorter discussion there because there are not so many subsidiaries, but headline numbers: -7% for Q1. Not so great. Air France itself, -6%. KLM, -11%. And as we've discussed in earlier, not only just here on this podcast, but also in our newsletter, KLM has been kind of encountering some new problems of late related to capacity and airport capacity, and Air France seems to ironically be the one that has been showing more improvement over time. And in fact, if you compare the numbers to 2019, Air France is actually better now than it was, whereas KLM is a whole lot worse. And finally, Transavia, which is the low cost unit of the group, they're doing a lot with that strategically, just kind of moving things around, moving planes around. And that did a -36% margin, but don't, everybody calm down, because very, 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 very seasonal airline, and sounds like that it's going to be just fine during the summer. So there you go. What else you want to know?
Well, for full editorial and journalistic transparency, Jay, I must make an announcement that I did fly with Brussels Airlines, and I did buy a tandoori chicken wrap on board and a soft drink as well to boost their earnings. So it seems like my efforts on Skiff Dollar, actually, but I was coming back from the conference in Brussels.
Yeah.
My €9.90 spent on board wasn't quite enough to tip them into the black ink.
Well, they did mention, I said they had a -20% margin. They said they would have had a -21% margin. It would have been worse if not for that
Ah,
sandwich you bought. Yeah, that's
it wasn't cheap, but it was quite tasty actually.
right.
As far as onboard catering goes.
Yeah.
Jay, we've previously discussed Lufthansa as a Lufthansa problem. We had an entire issue dedicated to at least the feature story not too long ago, as our subscribers will know. Is this representative of that, or are there any underlying trends that maybe are different from previous years?
No, I think what this is representative, and when I say this, I mean these kind of very bloody this flow of red ink that we're talking about now. I think that is representative of the labor unrest first and foremost. Yes, they do have very real cost issues, which we can talk about, or I'll just mention quickly that they do have the aircraft delivery delays, and they do have the GTF engine issue that has been plaguing the industry. They do have now they've gone in and signed all these new labor contracts to end the disputes, and they are very much inflationary. And then they also talked, to Carson Spohr, who's the head of the group there. He was talking about just the incredible increase in airport costs that they've experienced. I believe I heard this right, and someone check me on this and can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they said that their airport costs are up 80%, 80 from 2019 within Germany. And then they're going up again 20%, another 20% this week. So
Wow.
they've had a tremendous increase, and it's been so bad. It's kind of sometimes things get so bad that they get good. And what I mean by that is that airport costs in Germany have gotten so high that a lot of low cost carriers have just left. And in that sense, that's been good on the revenue side for Lufthansa. So, you wonder where it balances out. But certainly in the cost side, it's really bad. They also talked about, the increased costs for EU emissions trading, and they're going to have next year. They're going to have these, sustainable aviation fuel mandates. They've, they've talked about some of the increases in labor costs, not just within the company, but also at ground handling companies and airport staff that they outsource. So definitely have very big cost increases there and those, as I mentioned, aircraft supply disruptions. So a lot of messiness, but they also said, and this is something I think we've been, harping on a lot, that all of these supply side disruptions in the end can actually be a blessing in disguise because, as Carson Spohr said very clearly, these all of these shortages it's interesting. He was explaining how, like in the auto industry, if a factory shuts down or they fall behind in production, well, you can make it up over the next, you can add a shift or work have overtime or whatever, and eventually you make it up. And he was explaining how you can't really do that in the aircraft industry. So it's going to be years where aircraft capacity is going to be well short of what it should be. And that's going to very much be a tailwind for demand for, again, multiple years going forward, as it has been for the past, ever since demand started reviving post pandemic. I think the quote literally said it will be positive for many years, demand side. So it's almost like, we have all these headaches, costs are going up, we've got strikes, we've got this, we've got that, but demand is great. And one thing about that is, especially because premium demand specifically is very, very strong, they've been able to justify capital investments in their product. And so just very recently, they've introduced a brand new kind of long haul lie flat business product. First on the Lufthansa mainline, and then he's coming to Swiss. So that's rolling out imminently, and they hope that there's enough demand out there that people will pay for something like that. And based on what we know from what other airlines have said, it does. It seems like they'll, that's a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, the Allegris product, which I think debuts on Vancouver, if I remember correctly. Jay,
Yeah.
let's turn our attention very briefly to Air France KLM, with the caveat being, as you alluded to at the very start of the show, that Air France KLM is more than just Air France. But you got the Olympics in Paris this year, and not specifically the Olympics, any major sporting tournament of a certain global scale. You think, wow, that'd be a guaranteed moneymaker. All these sports teams coming in with their dozens of athletes and all the professionals, all the media, all the sponsors, all the hangers on, not to mention spectators and everyone else, paying potentially inflated corporate fares. Actually, you speak to a lot of airline executives, especially ones that generally do quite well in summer anyway and don't necessarily need the world visiting their city to fill planes. And events like the Olympics can cause a real headache. You've got everyone flying in and then nobody flying back out, and then suddenly everyone flying back out at the same time. It's not necessarily the gold rush that you might expect.
Exactly, and what happens also is you may have mentioned this, but the corporate travel just stays away. We don't want to have anything. We're not going to schedule a meeting during the Olympics. We're not going to schedule. We're not going to host a conference during the Olympics. Just think about how expensive all the hotels will be and the traffic and all that. So a lot of the high yield stuff just stays away. So generally, airlines don't like it. Now it's not universally negative because Air France will tell you that it is great for the brand. As long as everything goes smoothly. I'm old enough to remember back in the mid '90s, there was the World Cup was hosted in Paris, and the Air France pilots struck. They went on strike the whole World Cup or a big part of it, and it was just a tremendous black eye on their reputation. So hopefully, I don't think anything like that's in the cards this time. So I think
Yeah,
it should be
France '98, I think, because I think
France
that was one of
'98.
the
Yeah, it was
that
right.
was one of the last times Scotland got into a major football tournament. So
No
we
wonder why
remember it
you
well.
remember. Yeah, you would remember the dates. Yeah. The So hopefully everything goes smoothly and the reputation will actually be a net positive. And then they'll get infrastructure out of it too. I mean, France is building some new subway lines out to Orly Airport, or metro lines, I should say. It's out to Orly, and they'll get new, I'm sure, other new infrastructure and whatnot. So it's certainly not total loss, but it's don't expect third quarter summertime margins are all of a sudden going to look much better than normal. They're not. If anything, they might be, they might look worse. There are costs associated too. Remember, you have to, you want to make sure this goes out without a hitch. So you're doing extra training, and there's going to be days that are just going to be so extremely busy that you're going to have to, add a little extra staffing and all that. So your original point that this is not all good. I will just mention one interesting thing from the Southwest Airlines call that struck me. They did say that the Super Bowl in Las Vegas in February was actually a positive for their Las Vegas market. So it's not universal. They didn't talk about it in detail, but it seemed for them that they did get a demand boost. So I just wanted to mention that it's not like every airline. Every time there's a big sporting event that it's all horrible. But obviously, the Olympics is it's just giant, and it's across multiple days, and it's you know or multiple weeks even, and involves a lot of planning, a lot of
Yeah,
involvement with government, etc.
for sure, and the Paralympics as well that follow, and
Right,
of
right.
course, Jay, you've got the football World Cup coming to. Is it US and Canada? Is it Mexico as well,
I think
or is
it's
it
all
just
three. Yeah, I
all
believe it's
three?
all three.
Yeah, you hosting anything in Philly?
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure.
Well,
Yeah,
get ready, gird your loins.
yeah, yeah. We'll have to stay off stay out of the air that week. I'm sure it'll be busy people coming
You've
in.
got you've got a couple of years to plan. Uh, Fascinating to pick through those European giants with you, Jay. Don't go anywhere because in part two we are going to be turning our attention to the Nordics, Norwegian, Finnair, and the like. We will be right back after this very short break. Hello and welcome back to the Airline Weekly Lounge. I'm your host, Gordon Smith, and I'm joined by co host Jay Shabat, as usual. Part one, we were discussing Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, both the respective groups, that is, not just the standalone airlines. And in part two, we're looking at some Nordic carriers, which is something we don't necessarily get to cover in a huge amount of detail on the show, Jay, but we've had some interesting numbers out of the region in the past few days. Let's kick off with Norwegian, shall we? And this is an airline that our global listeners might know as sort of the pre-pandemic version iteration of Norwegian, not just
Yes,
flying within Scandinavia, but they were going all the way down to Brazil, to Argentina, crossing the Atlantic with dozens of flights to the US West Coast, even dipping down to Thailand, I think, towards the end. And they've really reined it in now.
don't forget about
And
Norwegian Argentina.
oh yes, so how could I forget the? Yeah, that was sort of the last roll of the dice. But
Yeah,
yeah,
roll the
they've
dice. That's actually a very perfect way to put it. That's if there's nothing that evokes the idea of gambling and starting a new airline in Argentina.
anyway, this is an airline that has been through the mill, to put it politely, and it's not looking too shabby at all. Talk us through the numbers that we have.
Right, and before I do that, I must clarify that it does, thanks to a Google search here, it does look like Philadelphia will be a venue for the 26 World Cup here. I believe that's the case. So just so our listeners are informed.
Well, you heard it here last.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's yeah. Go elsewhere for your football/soccer news. But
Indeed.
for news on Norwegian, here's some. They did a negative 10% operating margin in the first quarter, which again, First quarter is, we said it was bad in Europe in general. It's particularly bad in the Nordic region. And if you, these, by the way, these carriers, there's four of them in the Nordic region that reported last week. And if you've read our the Airline Weekly issue that just came out on Monday, you'll have seen all these numbers already and a write up with some analysis as well. But for those of you who haven't, negative 10% on Norwegian. And shall I read the other numbers for you too, Gordon, or
Go
should
on.
I?
Let's give it some regional context.
Okay, so Finnair negative 2%, which is actually surprisingly good. And they actually would have made a small, tiny little operating profit if not for some labor unrest of their own, as well as some volcanic activity that scared some passengers away. Finnair, in fact, did make a tiny profit last winter, so they are doing much better than expected. But we can hold them aside. Norwegian, I said negative 10%. Icelandair negative 27%. That was ugly. They do say that the summer is shaping up to be really, really good. So hopefully they'll be able to balance that out. And then Play, which is competing with Icelandair, startup airline, more or less kind of doing the same thing, negative 38%. They are they say they're skating on thinner ice, so to speak. They have less, less of an established balance sheet, an established business. So they're going to need to start turning things around a little bit quickly. And obviously the summer will be do or die for that. Well, that's a little bit, I think, extreme, say do or die, but they'll let's say very badly need a good summer. Okay, back to Norwegian. How are they doing? Rather well. I mean, this is an airline that's just very different from the reckless one, pre COVID Norwegian that Gordon just described. This is post bankruptcy Norwegian with a totally new management team and totally new contracts with workers, contracts with aircraft lessors, etc., contract with airports that are much more flexible, and most importantly, flexible in the realm of seasonality, which that's the theme we keep harping on. That Europe is a very, very seasonal market, and you've got to find a way to stem your losses in the winter and maximize your profits in the summer. And Norwegian now has contracts that much better enable them to do that. So it should be, and demand is looking great. I mean, they all four of these airlines are, yeah, pretty much all four. They say that it's demand should be coming in pretty strong this summer. So, and by the way, I should mention Norwegian had a very solid 9% operating margin in 2023. So this is an airline very much back on track, and now they've just taken over another airline called Widerøe, which is more of a corporate, has a lot of corporate and government traffic. So that kind of balances the business a little more. I mean, Norwegian was very heavy on leisure and family visit and worker traffic from the east and whatnot. So much more balanced demand profile now. And we can go on. They have the loyalty program. They have it's just looking like a healthier situation. And final thing I just want to say before I turn it back to you, Gordon, is that the first quarter did this year feature the Easter travel season. The Easter, it'll shift between first and second quarter depending on the year. This year it happened in the first quarter. I think we talked about that maybe with Volaris last year. Same thing. They got a boost from that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so the Nordic carriers did get that first quarter a little bit of help there. So keep that in mind. And then of course we've got the SAS bankruptcy too because they've downsized, they've restructured, another tailwind for Norwegian.
I was just going to say, any making the most of the turbulence that's going on at SAS? That'd be an interesting one. I did actually speak to Geir Carlson, who is the CEO of Norwegian.
Yeah.
Regular readers of AW will have seen my interview a couple of issues ago, and yeah, he was really upbeat, as you might expect. But across the board, Widerøe, like you said, that's more PSO routes. Even the milk run, the so-called milk run routes with the dash 100s, 200s, 300s, going all the way up to the Russian border in the extreme north of Norway. Very, very different operation. They've got a handful of V2s, but it's very much turboprops for the most part of their operation. And Norwegian seems to be positioning itself as a low cost carrier, but not quite, sort of cheap and nasty. Gear described it as we've got experience in our markets and we know the markets and we know our customers who will pay just that little bit more for a slightly more refined service. So they're not going to be battling on Skyscanner necessarily as the cheapest flight on every single route, every single itinerary, but they might be undercutting some of the legacy carriers, and that seems to be working for them quite nicely.
What I was just what airline is cheap and nasty? What are you referring to?
Well, I've got a little red alarm that rings on my desk anytime the lawyers get worried. So that's currently flashing. I
It's
will.
funny. That's always the argument these low cost carriers make. It's like we're not Ryanair. We're yeah, we're not. Yeah, we don't hate our passengers.
Absolutely not. No. But in terms of the dynamics at Finnair, you obviously impacted arguably more than any other carrier with the closure of Russian airspace, any European carrier certainly, because they used to take the so-called shortcut over Russia to offer flight times of around 8 hours between Helsinki, the capital of Finland, and cities in mainland China, Japan, South Korea, and deeper into Southeast Asia. That's now closed off. They're having to go the long way round, or even on certain routes over the North Pole, which is adding a huge amount to fuel, staff costs, environmental impact for an airline that really does care about sustainability. It's a sore one, and I was passing through Helsinki Airport last year, and they had a Junio aircraft that
Oh,
was
from China, yeah.
coming from Shanghai to Helsinki, and that was able to fly over Russia. Flight time around 8 hours 40. The comparable service from Finnair, that was 11 and a half hours. So even on fuel, if you ignore all the passenger inconvenience, all the staffing costs, all the operational stuff, environment. Like I've said, it's eye watering. And at the Airlines for Europe summit, both Ben Smith from Air France KLM and Carsten Spohr from Lufthansa Group both said that the situation where you've got some airlines able to serve Europe and fly over Russia, and some not able to, is unsustainable. And they were calling for governmental change in regulations. Whether we'll see that is anyone's guess. I'm just not sure that's gonna work, but we shall see. Jay, very very briefly on the Icelandic carriers, it's super important for a sort of hub and spoke model, isn't it? People aren't just flying to Reykjavik to go to the Blue Lagoon and see the volcanoes. They are often using Iceland as a stopping off point for a couple of hours, even a couple of days on their way from North America to Europe and vice versa.
That's the model, right? And that's been like that for decades now. I mean, I think they were doing that. Yeah, and they had backpackers in the 1970s. So exactly. That's the model. And geographically, the just Reykjavik happens to work very nicely. It's just not that far from the mainland U.S., particularly the East Coast. And nowadays, with the Maxes and the A321 Neos, you can actually do that. You can do that stuff with narrow bodies. They've actually for many years they've used the 757 narrow bodies, and you could just you could do more and more of it as these narrow body ranges get extended, and then of course you can go deeper into continental Europe. So it's been a very very nice business for them over the years. Never, I wouldn't call Iceland a hugely profitable carrier in any given year, but they've been able to like I said, maintain a nice business, and we'll see how they do this year. Kind of the same story. Demand looking very very strong for the upcoming summer. I mean, Americans are still they've got they've got a strong dollar in their pocket, and they're not spending it on Pelotons anymore, and they're not spending it on whatever they were a couple of years ago. On their garden and their a new couch for the living room. They're spending it on travel. So for that, now obviously they have Play in the mix now, which is a local competitor, and that does add a lot of add some extra capacity on certain routes, and so that that is does present a new challenge. But the again with the key with all these airlines, it's summer, summer, summer. How will things be in the peak third quarter?
Well, not long to find out now.
Yeah,
As
we're
we
getting
record,
close.
Yeah, we're getting close. Jay, fascinating as always to gather your insights there and discuss some parts of the world that we don't always get to cover on the podcast. If you've got any ideas, suggestions, areas, topics you'd like us to cover, you can reach us via email. My address is gs@skift.com. That's G for Gordon, S for Smith. And Jay can be reached via js@skift.com. That's J for Jay and S for Shabat. My thanks to producer Monica for making us sound, well, as good as she can make us sound. And thanks to Jay for joining me this week, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Airline Weekly Lounge podcast. Check out airlineweekly.com for a new issue every Monday and updates on the latest airline news throughout the week.